Good morning, everybody. I think we're going to get going now. First of all, welcome. Thank you so much for coming to cover the launch of Human Rights Watch's 2017 World Report. I'm going to turn over to Kenneth Roth, the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. He'll make a brief statement, and then we'll take questions. But before we get in, I also want to tell you that we have present quite a few other Human Rights Watch staff, specialists in different areas. And I want to flag particularly Sarah Margon, our Washington director, Maria McFarland, co-director of our US program, and Jose Miguel Vivanco, our Americas director. So they're going to be available to take questions afterwards if you want more particular detail on specific areas. But now I'm going to turn it over to Kenneth Roth.
Good morning, everyone. Human Rights Watch has been producing world reports like this for more than 25 years now. But this is a uniquely troubling time. In recent years, we've released this report in various capitals around the world that we thought illustrated the global problem of the moment. So in the last couple of years, for example, we released it in Istanbul, in Beirut. But this year, the troubling themes that we highlight bring us back to Washington for the first time in many years. The global rise, the global rise of populists poses an extraordinarily dangerous threat to human rights. Human rights exist to protect people from governments. Yet today, a new generation of populists is reversing that role. Claiming to speak for the people, they treat rights as an impediment to the majority will, a needless obstacle to defending the nation from perceived threats and evils. Instead of accepting that rights protect everyone, they encourage the dangerous belief that people don't need their rights to protect them against an overarching government claiming to act in their name. Now, the appeal of the populists has grown with mounting public discontent over the status quo. In the West, many people feel left behind by technological change, the global economy, and growing inequality. Horrific terror attacks generate fear and suspicion. Some are uneasy with societies that are now religiously and racially diverse. There's an increasing sense that governments and the elite ignore public concerns. Now, in this cauldron of discontent, certain politicians are flourishing and even gaining power by portraying human rights as protecting only the terrorist or only the asylum seeker at the expense of the safety, economic welfare, and cultural preferences of the presumed majority. They scapegoat refugees, immigrant communities, and minorities. Truth is a frequent casualty. Nativism, xenophobia, racism, Islamophobia, and misogyny are all on the rise. If the voices of intolerance prevail, the world risks entering a dark era. We forget at our peril the demagogues of yesteryear, the fascists, the communists, and others of their ilk who claimed privileged insight into the majority's interests, but ended up crushing the individual. When populists treat rights as an obstacle to their vision of the majority will, it is only a matter of time before they turn on those who disagree with their agenda. Such claims and the attacks on the checks and balances that constrain governmental power are perhaps the greatest danger today to the future of democracy in the West. They threaten to reverse the accomplishments of the modern human rights system. Which brings us back to Washington. Donald Trump's successful presidential campaign vividly illustrated this politics of intolerance. Sometimes overtly, Sometimes through code and indirection, he spoke to many Americans' discontent with economic stagnation and an increasingly multicultural society in a way that breached basic principles of dignity and equality. He stereotyped migrants, vilified refugees, attacked a judge for his ancestry, dismissed multiple allegations of sexual abuse, and pledged to roll back women's ability to control their own fertility. We see a similar scapegoating of asylum seekers, immigrants, and especially Muslims in Europe. Leading the charge have been Marine Le Pen in France and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. But there are echoes of this intolerance in the Brexit campaign, the rhetoric of Viktor Orban in Hungary and Jaroslaw Kaczynski in Poland, and far-right parties from Germany to Greece. Throughout the European Union, officials and politicians hearken back to distant, even fanciful times of perceived national ethnic purity, despite established immigrant communities whose integration as productive members of society is undermined by this hostility from above. We've seen where this can go. President Erdogan's increasingly dictatorial rule in Turkey illustrates the danger of a leader trampling on rights in the name of a majority. Last year, he used a coup attempt as an excuse to crack down not only on the alleged coup plotters, but also on tens of thousands supposedly associated with the exiled cleric Fethullah Gulen. A declared state of emergency became an opportunity to turn on perceived critics as well, closing down the independent media and civil society groups. Egypt, under President Sisi, underwent a similar evolution. Unhappy with the brief rule of the Muslim Brotherhood under President Morsi, many Egyptians welcomed President Sisi's military coup in 2013, but he has produced a rule that is far more repressive than anything that happened even under President Mubarak, who was overthrown in the brief Arab Spring. The rising tide of authoritarian populism has paralleled a new infatuation with strongman rule. If all that matters is the declared interests of the majority, the thinking seems to go, why not embrace the autocrat who shows no qualms about asserting his majoritarian vision, self-serving as that may be, and subjugating those who disagree? But the passions of the moment tend to obscure the longer-term dangers to a society of strongman rule. President Putin, for instance, has presided over a weakening Russian economy plagued by massive crony corruption. Fearing popular discontent, he has restricted assembly and expression, penalized online dissent, and crippled civil society groups. China's Xi Jinping has embarked on a similar path of repression. Worried as well that popular discontent would rise as economic growth slowed, Xi has embarked on the most intense crackdown since the Tiananmen Square democracy movement. The best way to counter this global assault is with a vigorous reaffirmation of the basic values underpinning human rights. But too many Western political leaders seem to have lost confidence in these values, offering only tepid support. Few leaders have been willing to offer a vigorous defense, with notable exceptions at times of Chancellor Merkel in Germany, of Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, and occasionally of US President Obama. Governments committed to respecting human rights serve their people better by being more likely to avoid the corruption, arbitrariness, and self-aggrandizement that so often accompany autocratic rule. Governments founded on human rights are better placed to hear and address their citizens' problems. And governments that respect human rights are more easily replaced when people become unhappy with their rule. Ultimately, responsibility lies with the public. The demagogues build popular support by spinning false explanations and cheap solutions to genuine ills. the best antidote is for the public to demand a politics based on truth and on the values on which rights-respecting democracies have been built. Lies do not become truth just because propagated by an army of internet trolls or a legion of partisans. Echo chambers of falsehoods are not inevitable. Facts remain powerful, which is why autocrats go to such lengths to censor those who report inconvenient truths, especially about their human rights abuse. So we all have a duty to assert the truth against those who prefer a post-truth era. Similarly, values are fragile. Because the values of human rights depend foremost on the ability to empathize with others, to recognize the importance of treating others the way we would want to be treated ourselves, these values are especially vulnerable to the demagogue's exclusionary appeal. A society's culture of respect for human rights needs regular tending, lest the fears of the moment sweep away the wisdom that built democratic rule. We all have a duty to reaffirm the importance of the basic values of human rights. Thank you, and I'd welcome your questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, Ruben Barrera with Mexico. Talk about the impact of what the Donald Trump election may have in the human rights arena. And you say that his rise to power appeals to racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and nationalism. I was wondering if you can elaborate. I wonder if you can elaborate about what could be the consequence of that. Are we going to see more hate crimes against minorities? What exactly is going to be the impact of this phenomenon?
Well, we're very concerned about the lowering of the bar of acceptable rhetoric that the Trump campaign represented. And frankly, even if he had lost, this would have been a legacy that we feared would be with us for a long, long time. I think we've learned that democracy is not just about institutions and laws, it's also about culture and values. And what worries us deeply is that Trump undermined, many of the basic standards of decency that are essential to successful democracy. So we certainly are worried about the legacy of the campaign. Now he's won. And we're all the more concerned that he's going to continue to govern with this disregard for basic decency that is essential for American democracy. And so this is, an overall concern. We obviously have many more detailed concerns about different programs, which I'd be happy to get into. But in an overall sense, that's our greatest concern about just the nature of the campaign that he ran and the presidency that we fear. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm working with the Radio Free Asia Public Service. So I noticed that you use ethnic cleansing in northern Burma, especially in the you heard me. Okay, I'm working with Radio Free Asia Public Service, and I would like to know about the ethnic cleansing in Burma. The Aung San Suu Kyi government repeatedly denied that there's no ethnic cleansing. But what kind of document do you release based on? How do you get the information exactly? Because no free media in that area and no NGO were allowed freely to go there. So there's a very conflict facts in there.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you.
Human Rights Watch has a researcher based in Burma. So we are able to conduct our own investigations. You're absolutely right that there are certain parts of the country which it's very difficult to gain access to. And as a result, we have to be in touch with local activists who are able to give us the firsthand information that they observe. But we are deeply concerned about precisely that denial that you're describing. And if I could, let me focus on the Rohingya, because they have probably been the most persecuted of the many ethnic minorities in Burma. And I don't pretend that Aung San Suu Kyi is running the persecution of the Rohingya. This is very much an army operation. We understand that there are still limits on her ability to control the army. But what is deeply disturbing is that she has not used her enormous moral authority to speak out against the army's ongoing violent persecution of the Rohingya, persecution that has only intensified since the attack on a police base a couple of months ago. So, I don't know why this is happening. I don't know whether it's because she personally, shares the broad dislike of the Rohingya within Burma. I don't know whether this is because she's just cozying up to the army, hoping to gain concessions from it. I don't know whether it's just her political calculation that she's going to appeal to the average Burman, and among the average Burman, the Rohingya are unpopular. But whatever the calculation, it is deeply disappointing, because here's a woman who has enormous stature, whom the world stood behind as a human rights champion. And now that she gains power, she is not standing up for the most severely persecuted minority in Burma.
Have you ever tried to send any mission, your own mission, to Burma?
Oh, yes. I personally visited Burma 2 years ago. In fact, a good part.
Did you send where the Rohingya live?
Yes, we've been to the Rakhine numerous times, yes.
You allow to go there right now?
Right now, no, but in the past we have. But we actually have sent people just the other side of the Rakhine, Myanmar border in Bangladesh, speaking to people who have just fled. So we very much have firsthand information. And what they describe is horrible. They describe the Burmese army, shooting randomly, raping women, burning down houses. We actually have satellite imagery that we published. It's all on our website, demonstrating these villages that have been burned down. Now, we see pictures of army troops standing there, and they claim, oh, we're putting out the fire.
Some photos are fake. Also,
Yeah.
you talking about the
Okay,
border
yeah.
being down.
Sir, let me just say, we're going to move on to others, but let me assure you, we are not talking about fake information here. We are talking about direct evidence of serious atrocities and a real failure of even the civilian authorities in Burma to stand up to these army abuses.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Luis Alonzo with the AP. This autocratic leadership you describe in Europe and the U.S. is nothing new for many other parts of the world. It might be new for the West, but not for the rest of the. So I would like to ask you, what how big is the contagious? It's just that the leaders in the West just are replicating. Did they learn the ways of the leaders in other parts? It's just a learning process, or are there any other indigenous reasons in the West?
I mean, you're right that it's not as if we discovered populism this year. We have had autocrats who have governed in many parts of the world for many years. The reason we highlighted this issue today is because it has become such a serious problem in the West. And the West has always been, in many ways, the most important bastion of not only, large scale, not complete respect for human rights, but it's also been an important voice for human rights around the world. And if we see, even in the West, this new infatuation with the strongman, it is only going to, in a sense, reinforce and encourage this tendency in other parts of the world. We saw this just yesterday, where a member of the ruling party in Hungary justified an intensifying crackdown on civil society by basically saying, this is the era of Trump. Trump won in the United States. We see Trump himself speaking in positive terms, about Putin, about Sisi. We saw yesterday, Tillerson, the Secretary of State nominee, refusing to speak in strong terms about Duterte's summary executions that he's encouraging in the Philippines. So, what we're worried about is not simply that, populism exists, that's always been the case, but that it's being reinforced and is spreading very rapidly, even in what had been strongholds of democracy in the West.
But it's pure contagion, the process.
It's pure what?
Like the illness was contagious to this part of the world.
Well, I think, I'm not sure that it's just contagion, is, that the West has caught the virus from elsewhere. I think what has happened is that there are, as I said, there are some genuine failures of governance in the West. Whether it's protecting people from being buffeted by automation in the global economy, dealing with the influx of immigration in many parts of the West, which are making some people uncomfortable, dealing with terrorism. These are genuine issues, and they have lent themselves to populist appeals. The populists are repeatedly offering simplistic solutions, often non-solutions, but ones that people want to hear, they want to rally behind. And it's it's easy to blame the immigrants. It's easy to blame the refugees. That's a simple answer to a complex problem. And that's what we're finding the populists doing. And there's been insufficient resistance to their short-sighted, simplistic calls. And so, frankly, part of what we're trying to do today is our traditional appeal to political leaders to resist the cheap appeal of populism. But we're also doing something different today. I mean, the introduction to the World Report ends with an appeal to the general public, which is not something that we traditionally do. But we highlight here the importance of the values of human rights. And these are not simply something that political leaders affirm, they're something the public needs to reinforce. And so we are saying that this is a dangerous moment, and we issue a cri de coeur to the public itself to stand up for the values that we believe they continue to think are important, but that their political leaders are undermining. Sure, yes.
Thank you. Silvia Ayuso with El País newspaper from Spain. Sorry, you've mentioned in your report we had Brexit last year, we had Donald Trump here, and you've mentioned as well some dangers in Europe. This year, we're having very important elections in some parts of Europe. Which are the ones that worry you most? How worried are you eventually that Marine Le Pen might come to power? So far, people say she's been deterred. And which other countries are you worried? Where are you putting the accent? And maybe as a second question, how much do you think that the rise of for many so unexpected rise of Donald Trump might help as a deterrent for other populist trends in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, how to read Trump's victory. Obviously, it's encouraging the populists elsewhere. Will it serve as a warning sign to other countries, that you have to take this all seriously, or the populists may actually gain power, or will it encourage them? It's hard to say. The three big elections coming up in Europe in the current year are France, Netherlands, and Germany. And of those, the one where the populist has the greatest chance of gaining power, I think, is France. The current polls show that Le Pen and François Fillon are most likely to make it to the second round. Now, the current polls say Fillon is going to win, but we've seen how much you can trust the polls. And so, I would watch that one closely in terms of a situation where a real populist who has overtly spoken out against Muslims, against immigrants, could gain power. In Netherlands, Geert Wilders' party could easily be the plurality party, but there's a long tradition of not building coalitions with him. So I think the threat of him gaining actual power is more remote. And the polls I've seen in Germany, nobody thinks the AfD is going to win. The question is more, will Merkel and the Christian Democrats maintain a plurality that enables them to then form a coalition government? Most of the polls suggest that they will. Merkel is very important because today she is the strongest European leader standing up for the values of tolerance, human rights, and democracy. So for she to fade from the scene, that would pose a huge threat to our basic values in Europe. Yes, sir. We called on you already, didn't we? Wait, I'm sorry. Let's go to somebody else who we didn't have. Yes, please.
Good morning. I'm Miriam Solly with the Medill News Service. In your remarks, you didn't mention anything about Syria, although I saw that it was in the press release. So what are our concerns moving forward? 2016 ended with Aleppo. Right now we're seeing similar attacks on Wadi Barada. And then also, in terms of the United States, what are the concerns when it comes to foreign policy in dealing with Syria and other parts of the Middle East?
Okay. Well, Syria, the reason the Syrian crisis is so disastrous is that Assad, backed by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, has chosen to fight this war not simply by targeting combatants, which is what the Geneva Conventions require, but by targeting civilians who happen to live in opposition areas, as well as civilian institutions like hospitals. And so the reason we have 5 million refugees, half the country displaced, 500,000 dead, is because of this targeting of civilians. And indeed, the local activists estimate that 90% of the civilian dead are due to Assad-allied forces, and they're targeting the civilians. Now, the US government, for much of the last several years, was reluctant to use the one source of leverage that could have made a difference here, which is putting pressure on Putin. Because Assad depends for his continuation in power on Putin's military support. Now, this began to change in the last few months of Obama's reign. And indeed, the US in the end ended up supporting a number of measures at the UN, including the appointment of a prosecutorial mechanism by the General Assembly that are ratcheting up the pressure on Putin. We've seen that whenever pressure is built up on Putin, there then ensues a period in which the killing subsides in Syria. So this can make a big difference. We're obviously happy that for the moment there's a quasi ceasefire. It's not absolute by any means. One concern I have is that even if there is not active shooting in many parts of the country, the ceasefire has not meant a lifting of the sieges. And we have 1 million plus people besieged by Syrian government-allied forces. And somehow ceasefire is being interpreted as meaning you can still fire at anybody who might bring humanitarian assistance into the besieged populations. So we shouldn't forget that Assad is continuing to use his strategy of besieging civilians and targeting civilians. With Aleppo having fallen, the next big concern is eastern Ghouta in the suburbs of Damascus. And that remains besieged. It's the largest besieged area in Syria today. Periodic bombing continues. And we're very worried that, with Aleppo now under control, that the troops that just pummeled and devastated Aleppo are simply going to be transferred to eastern Ghouta, where we're going to see Aleppo redux in a few months. So, absent serious pressure on Putin, we're going to see more of the same. Now, Trump's approach has been to say, oh, we're going to fight ISIS, and we're going to join with Putin and Assad to fight ISIS. Now, there are big problems with that. One is Putin and Assad have spent very little time fighting ISIS. They're mostly fighting the people opposed to Damascus. Second, a lot of why ISIS is so strong today is because of Assad's atrocities. And so if Trump is going to take the view that reining in Assad's atrocities are a secondary matter, that they're not really of concern to the primary goal of attacking ISIS, we're going to be in a much worse situation very quickly. Yes, back here.
In Africa, one of the countries that held elections last year was Gambia. What are your fears with the president refusing to leave? And also, which other African country are you looking at right now?
Well, with Gambia, we're obviously watching it very closely. Jama at first seemed to be the statesman, and for a few days said, yes, I accept my electoral loss. Then he's backtracked on that. By all indications, Barrow won, and we've been heartened by the strong response of ECOWAS and its insistence that the election be respected. So, what worries us now is Jama going to use violence to stay in power? And we're hoping that Gambia's West African friends will step in to exert serious pressure to prevent that. In terms of elsewhere in Africa, there are a number of places we could look. Maybe I should take a moment to mention the Democratic Republic of Congo, because this has been a source of serious concern. The latest negotiations theoretically have Kabila agreeing to step down by the end of the current calendar year after the holding of elections, but he hasn't signed that on the dotted line. He's had various representatives do that for him. In the meantime, his security forces have been killing protesters who are unhappy with his continued reign. So the Western pressure has been a very effective tool to constrain Kabila. The fact that the US government in particular has imposed targeted sanctions on a number of the senior security officials under Kabila who are leading this violent repression has helped to save lives and to put real pressure on Kabila to accept the constitutional need to step down. We hope that continues. We have no idea where Trump stands on this. European countries have also been reluctant to join in as vigorously as they should. I suspect we're going to need much more European leadership now with the new administration. But Congo could be an explosive situation if it's not handled correctly. So it requires real attention.
Are you satisfied with Nigeria's government take on Boko Haram, being, on their take that they're right
Well, I don't think anybody thinks Boko Haram is really curtailed. And indeed, we still have, these terrible terrorist attacks, increasingly using children and women. We have huge starvation as well as displacement in the Northeast. So Boko Haram remains a serious threat. Obviously, the Nigerian government has been proceeding more aggressively against it. We have concerns about the way the Nigerian government carries out its response. And I should say this exists, not only with respect to Boko Haram, but also with respect to its response to the protests that we're seeing in Biafra, the Shia marches in the center of the country. What these all have in common is that we've seen, overreactions by Nigerian security forces, excessive use of violence, and a real reluctance to use officials to account. And that's a dangerous formula. That is partly how Boko Haram emerged, and that is a formula that is only going to make Nigeria's many problems worse. So Buhari has spoken the right game at various points. He's talked about the importance of the rule of law, but he hasn't implemented it as vigorously as he said he would, and that remains something we're very actively urging. Sure. Yes.
Hi, I'm Tracy Wilkinson from the Los Angeles Times. You mentioned Tillerson a few minutes ago and the hearings from yesterday, and I know your office put out a statement expressing concern about his unwillingness to condemn big human rights abusers like Russia and Duterte and Saudi Arabia. My question is whether you see this, beyond the hateful rhetoric of Trump, if you see this as foretelling a major shift in U.S. foreign policy away from at least the stated priorities of human rights and democracy and women's equality and those sorts of things, if we're going to see a really major shift in U.S. foreign policy. Thank you.
Yeah, Tracy, that's exactly what we're worried about. And obviously we have our concerns about Tillerson just at the outset. This is a guy who has made his career by cutting deals with dictators. And suddenly he's supposed to be a statesman standing up for basic values of human rights and democracy. There is nothing in his decades of experience that suggests that this is something he cares about. I was not reassured by his performance yesterday. And what I saw was a man going out of his way to avoid condemning human rights violations. He claimed not to know. He had to have had his head in the sand not to know that Syria is committing war crimes or that Saudi Arabia is committing human rights violations. Please, you got to see the intelligence first. He cites your newspaper actually, and as if that's not reporting from the ground. It's just the newspaper. So this was not, this was not somebody who, was showing any indication that he wants to be out front on these issues. This is a man who was looking for excuse after excuse not to take a position. And given his history, and given the president he's going to be serving, that worries me deeply.
Hi, Cristobal Vasquez from Caracol Radio. Well, the whole world seems to be on fire right now, except Colombia. However, on your report, you mentioned you mentioned the threat and the murder of civilians, of social leaders and indigenous leaders in the country. How sustainable do you think the peace agreement would be, considering these threats, these murders that indigenous and social leaders, are suffering?
Well, we're very concerned about the 40-some social leaders who've been killed in the last year, and obviously that is a real threat to the Colombian peace, and it's something that we are going to be closely monitoring. While we're on Colombia, though, let me just take a moment and talk about the deal with the FARC. The Human Rights Watch received some criticism for our insistence on a better deal than the first deal. And some people said, oh, you're against peace, which was never the case. We very much wanted the peace process to succeed. But what we believed is that the Colombian government could do better, that it was possible to have a deal with the FARC and have better accountability for war crimes and other atrocities. And indeed, we were proven correct. After the referendum voted down the first pact, there was a better deal that came through, and one that did make significant progress with respect to the key issues we were concerned about. Command responsibility, for example, whether senior people are going to be responsible for atrocities committed by their troops, or similarly, the degree of custody or confinement of people who were serving the so-called deprivation of liberty. And that now is much more specific in the New Deal. There's still more to be done, and we hope that the implementation stage will address that. But what we learned is that, indeed we were right. It was possible to have a FARC peace deal that paid better respect to justice. Now, one of our huge disappointments was that after this second deal was completed, after the FARC had basically signed off on it, Santos, in the middle of the night virtually, because of the Army's insistence, changed the terms of the command responsibility section to make it easier for the Colombian generals to get away with their role in the summary execution of 3,000 young men who were dressed up as FARC soldiers and executed, the so-called false positive killings. It's important to stress that that last-minute concession by Santos had nothing to do with the FARC. The FARC had signed off on the deal. This was simply Santos succumbing to pressure from the Army. That is a deep disappointment. These were horrible atrocities that the Army oversaw, and generals and others who knew about it and permitted it to happen should be brought to account. And that Santos is now making that more difficult has nothing to do with peace and much more to do with his succumbing to the political pressure put on him by the Army and their political supporters.
A question.
Excuse me? Well, we certainly hope it'll be sustainable, but it's important for the Colombian government to put every effort into protecting social activists and to prosecute anybody who commits an act of violence against them. So, the sustainability of the peace process is going to depend on the actions of the Colombian government. The Colombian government knows how to protect people if it has to. It actually has a relatively effective, by Latin American standards, process of protecting activists. It's going to have to use this more widely. But more to the point, when there are attacks, it has to make sure that the attackers are brought to justice. That's the way to end these attacks.
Mariama Diallo, Voice of America. I'm not sure if you addressed this already. I came in a little bit late because of metro problems, but if you already did, I'll look at my tape. But it's about the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and some of the countries that are getting out of it. And we talked about Africa, Gambia, Burundi, South Africa, but you also have other countries that are really thinking about kind of not getting involved, like Russia, and recently Duterte talking about as well not kind of recognizing it. So I just want to hear your take on that.
Well, we were obviously concerned where in quick succession, Burundi, South Africa, and Gambia announced that they would withdraw from the ICC. Now, Gambia's decision has since been quasi-reversed by Barrow, so if Barrow actually gets to take office as president, I think Gambia will stay in the ICC. But we're really dealing with Burundi, where Nkurunziza is presiding over large-scale slaughter, and South Africa, where Zuma is kind of using the ICC to divert attention from his enormous corruption problems. So this is, not necessarily a problem of principle. This is a problem of convenience on the part of certain leaders. We've been very heartened by the broad reaction of African civil society reinforcing the importance of the court, recognizing that this is a court of last resort when many African nations have not been willing to stand up for the rights of their citizens and have not been willing to bring to justice those who've committed mass atrocities against them. So civil society is very much on our side, and indeed many African leaders, particularly in West Africa, have also stood up for the court. So we are a little less worried today than we were a couple of months ago, but there is a real need, not only in Africa but around the world, to stand up for the court. Now, I know the court is often, criticized for having focused too much on Africa. You can, spin that both ways. I mean, African victims have been neglected forever, and finally an institution is paying attention to them. So that's for the good. But we would like to see the court address serious abuses more broadly. And the impediments to that are often the fact that the relevant countries have not signed up to the court. But there are some real opportunities today. The court is looking at Afghanistan, it's looking at Palestine, there is looking at the Georgia war and the role of Russia there. So there are opportunities to broaden things. We'd like to see African governments, if they were sincere about wanting equal justice rather than no justice, they should be at the forefront of getting the International Criminal Court involved in Syria. The reason that hasn't happened is because Russia and China vetoed the effort. But if there was an outpouring of support from African governments for ICC involvement in Syria, that could begin to change the dynamic.
But what do you make of countries like also who should be supporting the court like the United States and who haven't really signed the treaty?
Well, the U.S. has actually been supporting the court, but has not signed on. And indeed, the one place where it played an unhelpful role was with respect to Palestine, where the U.S. has been actively pressing the court not to change its preliminary investigation into a formal, preliminary examination into a formal investigation. So we'd like to see more principled support of the ICC. But there, and similarly, if you look at Russia, China, they haven't signed on. I mean, Russia's withdrawal from the court is a little disingenuous because it was never a member to begin with. But the strength of the court is going to come from the breadth of its scope and its ability to really go after the world's worst human rights criminals wherever they're found. That's a work in progress. The court is what, a decade old now, a little more, and so it has accomplished a lot, but it clearly is still a new institution, and it needs nurturing and support.
Hi, my name is Sarada
No,
Tang.
we're going to get other people because you already had your turn, didn't you?
No, I haven't asked you yet.
I'm sorry. Then excuse me. Okay.
Hi, I'm from Radio Free Asia for Cambodian service.
Okay.
So in Cambodia, Prime Minister Hun Sen, been elected, he detained a lot of human rights activists, political activists, and also intellectual. And lately, he, in Cambodia, they just have a massacre on the, killing the one of the independent social analysts, and about more than 2 million people have marched for his body to his hometown. So by detaining all the political prisoners in Cambodia, more than 10 people over there right now. So what do you think about the democracy and future of Cambodia?
Yeah, I mean, we've been deeply concerned about the way Hun Sen has treated electoral challenges throughout his tenure. He's really been expert at finding ways of constraining opposition leaders, of undermining opposition parties, and certainly of undermining civil society. And as the perceived threat to his continuation in power increases, his repression seems to be increasing as well. So, this effort to kind of manage democracy so that it never amounts to a sufficient threat that he loses power is an enormous problem, and it's one that we do, as you mentioned, see intensifying in the past year.
So, Prime Minister Hun Sen also he praised Trump so much by being president of America. So, do you think that the upcoming U.S. President can do anything to Cambodia about the Cambodia democracy?
Well, we're seeing many strong men like Hun Sen secretly or not so secretly applauding Trump's ascendancy. And there's going to be a real test on Trump early on as to what signal he sends. Is the signal going to be, I'm perfectly happy with strongman rule, we're going to abandon decades of bipartisan U.S. commitment to human rights and democracy around the world? Or is he going to say, no, you misread me, I still believe in these things? I don't know the answer to that yet. We're deeply worried. But, Cambodia's a perfect example of a strongman who is looking to read Trump's arrival in the White House as a green light to intensify his repression. And the duty is going to be on Trump to make clear, if that's what he believes, that that's not the message emanating from Washington.
Ken, we're getting quite a lot of questions from Twitter, so I want to ask you one before I hand over to a colleague from FA. What do you think has led to the recent rise of demagogues? Why are we seeing this populist surge now?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to say why now. I do think that, a significant segment of society is feeling unheard by government. And I mentioned some of the reasons. It's people feeling left behind by the global economy. It's people who are have a sense of disquiet about the cultural changes, the immigration, the demographic changes that they see. Sometimes it is just fear of terrorism. But in this, concoction of serious concerns, it's easy for a demagogue to flourish. The demagogue has simple answers. It's the other guy that's at fault. It's those newcomers. It's those minorities. And none of these problems are simple. People like sometimes the simple solutions offered by the demagogue. And the real duty on all of us, and I say this, as individual citizens, as journalists, and as political leaders, is to cut through that simplicity and to demonstrate that the more complex recognition of the truth and the more complex respect for values are really the best way forward, and that the simplistic solutions of the demagogues are wrong. So we are, at a moment where populism is on the rise, but I don't think populism is inevitable. Populism in itself can be self-defeating as people see that these simplistic answers are not actually solutions. But it's going to be a real battle. And there is a role for the public and the media to fight back by continuing to insist on the truth and by continuing to insist on not only the importance of values, but on the threat that their neglect represents.
Hi. Thank you very much. My name is Beatriz. I'm with EFE, Spanish Newswire. I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the proposal that Donald Trump made to mass deport millions of immigrants? What consequences this would have? What message would this action send to other countries who are going against this collective? Thank you.
Okay, well, the good news is that Trump has backed off his threat to deport all 11 million undocumented Mexican migrants. We're now down to 2 to 3 million criminals among them, even though nobody thinks that there are 2 to 3 million criminals among them. And indeed, to even get to something close to that number, you've got to include legal permanent residents who may have committed some kind of crime. Now, our concern is, severalfold. One is that, what does it mean to be a criminal? If people are violent criminals, fine. I don't think anybody objects to their deportation after appropriate process. But many of these so-called criminals, had a traffic offense or a minor encounter with the law. A lot of them, the only crime that they committed was illegal reentry. So it's like, using the criminal law to reinforce the immigration law as an excuse to deport people. And indeed, one of the largest growth crimes in the United States is the immigration crime of entering the United States. So, I think we have to be very careful in looking at what this criminal label means. Why is this of concern? If you look at the 11 million undocumented migrants, many of them, I would suspect a significant majority, are at this point long-term residents. They are active members of their community. They have jobs. They have families, many of whom might also themselves be U.S. citizens. It would be hugely disruptive to summarily deport these people. And one thing we've always insisted upon is that any deportation proceeding consider the ties of an undocumented migrant to the community, and that be a significant factor in weighing whether deportation is appropriate or not. We're also deeply concerned about the threat that Trump has made to enlist local law enforcement officials in this deportation effort. Now, this is something that Obama didn't do. But if Trump were to go back to that practice, that could undermine, frankly, the safety of all of us, because it means that if you're an undocumented migrant, you're not going to trust the police. And that's going to be the case, if you're a victim of a crime. It's also going to be the case if you're a witness to a crime. And suddenly you have 11 million people in the United States who are going to have to stop cooperating with law enforcement efforts. That is a serious public security threat to all of us. And so we should really think twice before taking a force, the local police that are there for the safety of everybody in the community, and turning them into a tool of mass deportation.
Follow up. If we remember what President Obama said at the beginning of his administration, maybe not many people will expect that he will be the president who deport the largest number of immigrants. He had deported more people than the previous president. Mm-hmm. Now we have a president with a very harsh rhetoric against immigrants. So, do you allude the fact that Donald Trump has said now that he's going to deport maybe 3 million of criminals? So are we talking about that you expect that more people will deport under this administration, maybe in a shorter time than Obama's time?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to note that, Obama was himself a mass deporter. Now, it evolved over time. I think it started off with perhaps the naive hope that the Republican Congress would cooperate with him in immigration reform, and that if he held the line on new immigration, that immigration reform might come. It never worked out. Toward the end of his term, he did focus in a much more limited way on deporting genuine violent criminals, and made efforts, not simply through DACA and various efforts to safeguard long-term residents who happen to be undocumented, but also to really redirect immigration efforts. Now, the court stood in his way, and so changing that as a formal matter was more difficult. But I think the impetus was there to focus on the people who pose a real violent threat, and not people who are simply here by virtue of not having the proper papers. I think we have to recognize that, America has built an economy around the work of 11 undocumented migrants. And there is something deeply unfair about having, made the economic life of all of us better through the labor of these people, but give them no legal security whatsoever. And out of a matter of basic fairness, if people have been in this country for some number of time, some period of time, conscientiously working and contributing to society, their status should be legalized. So this is not about new arrivals. This is about people who are established members of the community. But it's worth noting that net migration from Mexico has basically been zero for some time. Now, will that change if Trump undermines NAFTA, and if the economic growth that Mexico has enjoyed is suddenly undermined through Trump trade policies? You may see a sudden influx of immigrants because the Mexican economy plummets. But if the economy stays roughly the same, I think we have every reason to believe that net migration will continue at zero, and that the real issue is how do we treat people whose labor has helped to build the American economy today? Are we going to give them the basic decency of a legal status so they don't have to worry every day as the wife or husband kisses the family goodbye that they're not going to make it back home at the end of a day's work because they happen to bump into some immigration officer? Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Right over.
Thank you. Gary Forber from the Epoch Times. I was wondering if Human Rights Watch is concerned that by targeting President-elect Trump, that your influence with the U.S. government will diminish. Wouldn't it maybe be would it have been a better strategy to just make specific criticisms of particular policies and leave out the general characterization of him as a demagogue and so forth? Just wondering if you considered a different strategy, because now you're on one end and people will consider it partisan. As I write this article up, I'm going to have a hard time sort of making it peer neutral.
Yeah, I should stress we're completely nonpartisan, and we work with people on both sides of the aisle in Congress. Indeed, we feel that Congress today has an incredibly important duty, including its Republican members, to stand up for basic rights and human rights, and democratic principles. So this is not a partisan issue. This is a rights issue. Now, Human Rights Watch has engaged with many of the worst governments in the world. The fact that we're public critics doesn't preclude us from engaging with them, because governments understand that we bring facts to the table, that we operate on the basis of principles, and so even overt dictatorships deal with us. Certainly, U.S. governments, hostile and friendly, have dealt with us. Our best way of protecting human rights is to be outspoken about them, and not simply this or that policy, but also broader political trends if those are threatening to human rights. And we see those threatening trends today. We feel we have a duty to speak about them.
Do you see that you've treated him differently than previous presidents?
No. Look at how we treated Bush after 9/11. And they still talked with us all the time, including at the highest levels. We're being very consistent here.
Ken, I have another question from Twitter, which is, are you concerned that the change of leadership, both in the U.S., at the UN, and at the AU, is going to complicate progress in South Sudan?
Well, we're very worried about South Sudan. I think some of you may have seen that just today, despite the South Sudanese government's absolute inability to stop the ethnic and political slaughter that they are rejecting the UN's offer of 4,000 additional peacekeepers. And this is, South Sudan is one of the most explosive situations in Africa today. It's one where the greatest number of lives, or one of the greatest number of lives, are at stake. And so, we're very worried about the lack of a solution here. Now, the Obama administration, frankly, was much too slow to ratchet up the pressure. It was really only in the last couple months that it endorsed an arms embargo. And even to this day, we are not able to get an arms embargo through the UN Security Council. We've seen that even the peacekeepers who have been deployed in South Sudan have been incapable in their current numbers of protecting large numbers of civilians. We've had people slaughtered really, right in front of peacekeepers. And if Juba is not willing to accept these additional peacekeepers, that's a very bad sign. The one other step that is sort of stillborn has been the promise of the African Union. If it doesn't like the ICC, it always talks about African or national justice. In this case, the African Union has offered to create a so-called mixed international national tribunal for South Sudan in order to address the mass war crimes that have taken place there, but we've seen no progress on that front. So we're going to need, a number of these steps taken if we're going to curtail what is really a dangerously explosive situation.
Thank you again. You already discussed Colombia and the deportation issue, but I would like to ask you a regional comment on Latin America. What are the main challenges there? Is President Maduro included in this description of autocratic leaders? And is Mexico on the top of the radar as well? Could you please give us a regional?
Yes. Well, Maduro is absolutely mentioned in the report quite prominently as one of these autocratic leaders who has been a disaster for his country. Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution claim to be there to achieve the best for the poor. And if you're a poor Venezuelan, life is pretty miserable right now. There have been times where housing has been arbitrarily destroyed without much recourse. People don't have adequate access to drugs, to food. The economy's in collapse. And this is by a leader who is undermining any check or balance on his authority. The opposition won the National Assembly, and what good has it done? Because Maduro controls the courts and has systematically chipped away at any effort by the National Assembly to rein him in. So, Venezuela is a very good illustration not only of the strongman phenomenon, but also the disaster that it can represent for the people of that country. While we're on the same point, Cuba is a country that we've addressed in the report. And obviously the big development of the last couple of years was the normalization of relations between the U.S. and Cuba. We've been disappointed that this has not been accompanied by significant improvements in human rights in Cuba. There were some modest improvements in the years before normalization with respect to travel and internet access. But if you look at what has happened since then, we still have these ongoing short-term detentions as a method of curtailing any organized demonstrations or protests or any efforts by civil society to make the voices of the Cuban people heard. The answer to that, and frankly the answer similarly in Venezuela, is a broad multilateral approach. We know that unilateral pressure from the United States just plays into the hands of demagogues like Castro or Maduro. And what's needed is broad multilateral pressure. There were steps taken toward that in the case of Venezuela. The democratic charter has been invoked, but hasn't really been pursued. And we hope that the foreign ministers will take ongoing efforts to use the democratic charter to really scrutinize and put pressure on Maduro to allow the reemergence of civil society and respect for electoral government. Similar kinds of multilateral pressure are going to be needed in Cuba if we're going to make any progress there. Pressure from the U.S. alone is not going to be sufficient. Now, with respect to Mexico, we're quite worried because there has been a real increase in violence. We're not back to the worst of the worst in 2011, but we're pretty much close to the 2012 figures, which were bad. And this, violence is due to a number of very clear facts. It's the involvement of the military in the anti-drug effort, even though militaries notoriously don't have the subtlety or the training of police. It's a product of the corruption of the police, and it's a product of the failure of the government to insist on the rule of law and to hold abusive officials to account, with the paradigmatic case being the 43 disappeared students in Guerrero. And there, not only did the government do nothing to really bring to light what had happened to those students, but it actively obstructed efforts to examine the inadequacy of its criminal investigation. So these are just a quick shorthand of some of the concerns we have in Latin America. Okay, I think we're, yes, okay.
Fadi Mansour with Al Jazeera Arabic. Could you give us a general assessment of major trends in human rights in the Middle East and the main hotspots in the region?
Sure. Well, I mean, we've talked about Syria. I mean, in the case of Iraq next door, we're concerned about, in the operation to retake Mosul from ISIS, will that proceed without the kind of summary retaliation against the Sunni population that we saw, for example, when Fallujah was retaken? And while the Iraqi government does seem to be doing a more serious effort to rein in abuses, by the so-called Popular Mobilization Forces, the largely Shia militia, although they've been more integrated now, we're worried about whether that will continue as the advance on Mosul proceeds. So that's frankly essential if we're not going to see a revival of ISIS in some form. The reason we have ISIS today is in large part in Iraq, because after al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated, the Maliki government at that stage proceeded to govern in such a sectarian way that it sort of fueled a new Sunni revival, which ended up being ISIS in its Iraqi version. So we need to avoid that. In Yemen, where the Saudi-led coalition has repeatedly bombed civilians, there's a real need for pressure on them to stop. Now, the U.S. has made some gestures in that respect, stopping the sale of cluster munitions, cutting off, some weapons sales, but the vast majority of billions of weapons still go forward, and the U.S. continues to provide, not only intelligence, but also aerial refueling to the bombers that go and then, bomb civilian institutions and civilian markets and the like. The UK has been just as bad. So there is a real role that the West can play here, but of course, lucrative arms contracts are at stake, and the West has been reluctant to use its influence as a result. In Egypt, the Egyptian economy is having obvious problems. Sisi has not been successful in reining in the insurgency in the Sinai. He, under the guise of containing violent Islam, has completely undermined any conceivable, organized, peaceful challenge to his rule. And you see this in the decimated press, human rights groups that have been, swept up, a silent civil society. And the West has been much too tolerant of Sisi, sort of figuring, well, there's not a big war there, we'll just go with the strongman. It's a very short-sighted approach. I don't know where else you want me to go. But.
I guess my question was, 6 years after the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, to put things in perspective, do you think the human rights conditions in the region are improving or not?
I mean, no, I wouldn't say they're improving at the moment. I mean, I think we're facing, very serious violence in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya. We're seeing sort of reinforced repression, certainly in Egypt, but also in lesser forms in places like Jordan or Morocco. Saudi Arabia, you've got this, reformist deputy crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who, has these big economic visions, speaks a little bit about kind of more empowerment of women, but at the same time is not been lifting the big restrictions on women, the guardianship laws, or allowing any kind of civil society to organize. So, sadly, the brief promise of the Arab Spring is long gone, and at this stage, it's a matter of containing a fairly negative trajectory. I think we're going to call it quits. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for coming. I just want to remind journalists in the room that apart from the Washington, U.S. and America's directors, we also have Human Rights Watch experts from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, on women's rights, refugees, and business and human rights. So if you have follow-up questions, speak to me and I'll make sure to put you in touch with the relevant stuff. And thank you all for coming. So yeah, we have a number of things lined up for you now.
Okay.
German TV and a couple of others.
WhatsApp.